Well, hello, Fay Johnson. Thank you for joining me on True 30 this morning. I'm happy to have you.
It's a pleasure, Joey. Thanks for having me.
So, as you may or may not have heard, Meta has unplugged its fact checking program. And of course, this came with a flood of news, lots of pundits talking on every network humanly possible at this point. And knowing that your background as a trust and safety executive at Meta and X, I thought you would be the perfect person to join us to help our audience better understand, first and foremost, what is trust and safety, what is fact checking, all of those things. So, why don't you tell me a little bit about that? Let's just start with what is fact checking and what is trust and safety within these organizations?
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me, Joey. So, trust and safety is an umbrella term used for the discipline that a lot of sort of large platforms use to keep their people safe, whether it be their customers or a marketplace, or in the case of Meta or Twitter, or say YouTube, where there's a lot of user generated content. There's an effort to make sure that the content that people see on their platform is either in line with the company's sort of principles or brand that they want to be putting out there, or ensures that people are safe, whether that be from fraud prevention, making sure people aren't being swindled out of money, or seeing content that is either illegal or harmful or potentially has a negative impact on society. So folks who say that they work in trust and safety may be on the policy side, they could be on the technical engineering side, they could be a person who's operations oriented. And then there's obviously folks who actually build products the same way you build a consumer product anywhere else. And so my discipline has been leading product teams that we're building and the things that people see on the platforms around like mute features, safety features like block, or the ability to report content that you see that you find problematic or that you think violates the company's policies, or that you just think are problematic yourself. And then there are sort of often a three-pronged approach, which Meta has taken, which is sort of a removing content that is problematic, reducing visibility, which might be downranking or sort of hiding within a comment string, something that is sort of borderline or potentially inflammatory or problematic. And then the last one is sort of an inform approach, a form or warn, where the content itself may not need to be removed or needs to be stayed up for political reasons or for social discussion reasons. And that's where a fact-checking label or additional details are provided to folks to reduce any sort of harm created from that content.
Cool. Thank you. So, that said, given your vast experience in this space, do you think there's short-term implications and or longer-term implications to this decision? Like, what do you think is going to be the short-term problem with unplugging from fact-checking?
Fact-checking has been a investment by a variety of different platforms and a whole bunch of folks across the industry to reduce visibility or belief in or sharing of content that has sort of false premise or is inaccurate. And yes, there are going to be real consequences to this, although I will say that fact checking on Meta was something that was applied in a really limited format. It has something that it was applied both in the United States and elsewhere. I will note that Meta's decision is to remove fact checking in the United States. At this point, the company hasn't indicated an intention to remove third-party fact checking in other countries. We may remember that in Myanmar, there was a lot of concerns around the way false information was being spread that sort of drove negative sentiment towards one of the minority groups that ended up leading towards a lot of actual violence in the country. So there have been real consequences to misinformation spreading on large platforms like Meta and Twitter. And so there can be real world consequences to misinformation on these platforms. And I think what we're going to see here at Meta is more likely going to be more questionable content being shared and a sort of change in the freedom that people feel to share content that they actually know isn't linked to accurate information. Because I think one of the things that is a upside of fact checking is it's almost like a speed bump. It makes people pause and think. A potential bad actor or a person who's sort of falsely intending to try and sway an audience, they now know that that sort of goalie has been taken out, and they have the ability to potentially shed and sort of share rather misinformation more readily.
Cool. I appreciate that. That helps a lot. So I watched an interview with you previously, and it said you believe that platforms have a role in public discourse. You want to talk a little bit about that and what you think their role is?
I think there's responsibility that falls both on the individual person who's using the platform and then also on the platform itself. And I think that a company every company gets to decide what kind of brand it wants to have, what kind of content it wants to allow. There's a very large difference between the Disney Channel and YouTube and OnlyFans and Instagram and TikTok or Twitter or Meta, right? Each are a platform. Obviously Disney is created content that they do for themselves, but then there's sort of the range of user-generated content platforms where there's a different brand, a different tone for the kind of content that's on the platform itself. And I think with that, a company has to decide what roles it wants to have, how does it enforce that, and what kind of sort of minimum bar do they set for what kind of content ends up on their platform.
Okay. So challenges in content moderation. You've led initiatives at Meta's oversight board and fairness in machine learning. What do you see as the biggest challenges in designing and enforcing effective content moderation processes? Because it sounds like it's pretty expensive and pretty onerous. And as you mentioned previous, it doesn't even affect the majority of the content out there. So how do you do it?
Yeah, it's a great question. Essentially, you really need to invest in proactive moderation if you want to be able to set a minimum bar of safety for everybody. Although this is very expensive and not every company has the resources to do it. I've worked at platforms where they've had one giant classifier, essentially a card matching game, if you want to think of it that way, where they say, here are all the things that are examples of things that violate our policies, and here are all the examples of things that don't. Get good at doing the matching game to categorize into okay and not okay. And that's one way to approach it. Places like Meta that have been investing in this for a very long time have unique classifiers for each policy harm type that get trained on the data over a period of time and actually have really high accuracy. As much as Meta gets a finger wag from people on the internet for sort of things that are on the edge or in this area that we may consider gray, the majority of content that Meta takes down are things that I think you or I would be really grateful for, and that are really anchored around sort of common civility norms about what's okay and what's not okay. And those classifiers have been trained for 8-10 years and have really high precision and really high recall rates that are in the sort of 99.8% precision things, where most of that sort of really harmful content comes down before people see it or report it.
Okay.
So one of the things that's happening now is Meta saying, hey, we're going to change the bar where we apply our proactive moderation and shifting it to be a place where a little bit more content is permissible on the platform. And I think that will then sort of shift the responsibility onto users to have to figure out how to take actions to protect themselves or to reduce visibility of things that they find to be problematic.
Okay, so you also mentioned, and I asked you this offline, but the idea there is that Professor Scott Galloway is someone that I follow. And I've listened to his podcast and I've watched him on numerous interviews now. And he actually said that somewhere in the lines of $5 billion was spent. And I can't clarify these numbers because I can't find anything on it. But in an interview with CNN, he said that Zuckerberg has effectively saved upwards of $5 billion with this move. And with the price earnings ratio of 30, that's $150 billion increase in market capitalization. And considering Zuck owns 15% of the company, that adds $15 to $20 billion to his net worth. So he said that shouldn't be, thrown out the door because that does mean something. And then I tie that because you mentioned in one of your other interviews that the future of fact checking may actually include third-party organizations. So if companies like Meta, who are that big and can spend that kind of money, is there a room for third-party organizations, or is that something you see becoming part of our future where companies can't afford it, but they can hire a third party to implement some of the processes and large language models that you're talking about?
Yeah, I think that's you catch on a couple important things. Will Meta save money from this move? Yes, they will. There is a cost associated with both machine learning and the sort of model maintenance that needs to be done to be able to have the content that does the sort of proactive moderation. And then there's obviously the cost on human review, which is where if you want to appeal something or you want to sort of add to improving those models, it looks like they are going to shift towards more human moderation costs. But if they are reducing the volume of things that they are investing in from a proactive perspective, there could be sort of some savings because they're not continuing to invest in keeping and maintaining models because models degrade over time.
Okay.
I think the area where he probably is positioned, and when I say he, is actually probably not appropriate to frame it that way, that Meta, the company, is positioned to save money is actually probably on regulatory fines and the enforcement and some of those sort of legal things that Meta is wading into currently with the U.S. administration. Although we will see what this does to the relationship with the EU and Australia and other countries that have sort of stronger regulations that might enforce fines on Meta because of this shift. You asked a question about third-party fact-checking.
Yeah.
All of Meta's fact-checking has been done by third-party groups. None of it's been done by Meta in-house employees. So third-party fact-checking, they've actually been hiring folks who have been credentialed as fact-checking bodies. And the way that the system works is that content needs to be reviewed by folks from different political backgrounds, and they have to do sort of an investigative thing to make sure that they're finding information to determine whether or not something is true. And they may have folks that focus on medical misinformation or elections-related misinformation or public events. And so those folks are experts in sort of digging into the details. They're almost like an investigative journalist to determine whether or not something is true. And that's always been done by a third party as a way to have an accountability that Meta itself wasn't determining what was true. So third party labels, and once something is agreed upon by enough fact checkers within a particular group, then a label is applied. And so will there be an investment in these areas? We'll see. I don't actually know whether or not the large platforms are going to all be moving away from having fact checking, or whether or not they'll move to the system that Meta has been calling out that they're sort of adopting from X, which is a community notes system, which actually relies on individual users to volunteer to participate on writing notes to sort of create additional context around what's being shared.
Okay, can you walk us through that specifically? Because community notes is the big discussion on a lot of these interviews. So if I'm on X and I say something completely outlandish, what does that look like? What does community notes look like at the actual day-to-day operation? Like, who you have to opt in to be part of that is the first step, right? So what does that look like? What does that mean?
I haven't worked on the community notes system at X or at Meta, so this is a little bit out of my purview, but I can share that the idea is that individuals opt in to being part of a community notes program, or they apply. My understanding is that there isn't a particularly high bar. It's one of those things where there's not a very large percentage of people who actively choose to participate in these programs. And the idea is that you get kind of classified based on the notes that you are producing. And I believe potentially on some of the content that you have presented to sort of be classified into a right or left-leaning position. And for a community note to get posted, there has to be consensus or an agreement from people from the right and the left that something is happening. And this is a potentially good way to identify where there's commonalities, but where that sort of system has its limits is when something may be a strongly held belief by one side or the other side of the political spectrum, and there cannot be consensus, but something still may be factually true or accurate that is actually being distorted or not being able to be labeled because it's been such a polarized topic and there hasn't been consensus met on that particular topic. So that might not get a note applied to it. And there's also questions around the bias that can be injected into these systems by who chooses to participate in the programs.
Yeah.
I worked at Nextdoor where I was in charge of trust and safety, and we had a community-based moderation approach. And one of the things that I spent a lot of time thinking about is who is volunteering to review the content by their neighbors. And are those folks who are volunteering to do this good citizens who actually have, and that may be the altruistic element of it, but are they a good representation for the norms of everybody? Mm-hmm. And is there an age tilt in who has the time to do this? Are we capturing the busy parents who have young kids who may be a little bit more attuned to youthful speech or what's okay or what's sort of considered humor? Or are all those people at work and not spending their time on a particular platform and therefore not engaging in this particular way? And the folks who are determining what stays up or gets commented on is maybe a particular demographic that isn't sort of attuned with the thing. And you sort of have to consider, where are labels coming from? Where is additional context coming from? And does it skew any particular direction just by the self-selection process? So I think it'll be interesting to see what Community Notes does to Meta. I can imagine it's going to provide more labeling than the third-party fact-checking did, because there was such a small application for third-party fact-checking across Meta's platforms. But I think it would have been best to have a yes and approach to this, where you have professional
or not either.
Yeah, and also having Community Notes to sort of round out context, because I think that's something that can be really valuable.
Because one of the things I read, and my homework on this is pretty limited, but the idea around Community Notes that bothered me, and coming from the ad world, we did market research for the same reason. We had questions about who did we actually pool in our qualitative sample, right? So the same thing to your point. What do you do? How do you actually govern the people that sign up to be part of the Community Notes infrastructure? That's one issue. The other issue is that it takes a long time, sometimes days, for the Community Notes to come back. So information, as they talk about, false information can spread around the world before truth even gets out of the gate, right? So it's like one of those things seems pretty to be a problem for me on that Community Notes side of things. And then just the width and breadth of the community at large, it's 3 billion people. So, how are you going to have, even if you have 1 million people in the Community Notes side of the business, you're still dealing with just a maelstrom of information that you can't possibly understand at the macro level. I mean, it seems a little bit, it's daunting, I guess, is the best way to look at it.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of advocates for Community Notes because they believe it's a way to bring voice in from the public and make sure it's on a closed box when it comes to what's determined to be okay and not okay on the platform. I have a bit of a bias towards proactive moderation done with transparency and an ability to appeal and ask for additional review and catch where something has gone wrong because of speed. I think that's one of the things that we're busy trading off on. We may see more dehumanizing language or negative toned language on the platform as the sort of remove, reduce, and inform levers that are typically applied or maybe reduced in certain areas. But we'll have to see what ends up sort of happening across the platform. And my encouragement for folks are that there are systems that you can use as far as being able to report content, to mute people, to block folks if you need to, that will allow you to sort of have agency in this process if you feel like something is problematic to you in the broader community.
Okay, so you mentioned third-party organizations and their possibility. What do you think of governments stepping in? Do you think that's a possibility? Not just in America, but elsewhere.
I mean, governments have always leaned on large companies. I think it's part of their responsibility. We elect people into office that are intended to represent our values and to advocate on our behalf. That's at least the vision that a lot of folks who are part of democratic processes, it's a vision for that. So there's, I think, a role for governments to play. And I think it's challenging it's challenging for a Meta or an X or a Google or an Apple or any of these places where they are serving a customer base that's global and trying to figure out what are the commonalities. I started both Twitter and Meta's regulatory compliance product working groups. And one of the things that I often asked was, what are the most common requests that we're getting from governments? What do most of the legislations say? What are the themes? And what can we pull out so that we can have a thoughtful, considered, well-structured response that actually applies where governments are calling us to do something differently, and do it in a way that isn't creating a lot of tech debt or confusion, or you can do something in one country and not in another. There were certain things that we really had to consider, because you could be logging into a computer in Germany where certain terminology is allowed or not allowed. And you could try and type something, but we might have your account logged in as you being based in the United States. And then we'll have to sort of figure out what jurisdiction is applied in this context. Is it to you as a U.S. citizen with a an account associated historically and mostly with the United States? Is it the IP address that you're logged into in another country? It creates a lot of kind of complexity about what is the responsibility of a company. At what point do companies actually have sort of the right to set their own rules and determine their own policies? And it sounds like Mark and the broader team at Meta are sort of positioning themselves to advocate for a little bit less government engagement in that.
That's what I gathered too. So another thing, a lot of our listeners actually asked one question when I put this out there. AI. How is AI going to help trust and safety? I mean, you've been part of that as well. What does that look like?
I think we're going to see both AI helping and AI probably at the same speed creating new challenges.
Okay.
And so I think it will be a new space that folks who are in my profession will need to grapple with. There are a lot of, you were talking about potentially growth for industry in this area. And I think we're seeing a lot of new startups that are leveraging AI to provide third-party trust and safety functionality to smaller companies, which I'm really excited to see. And one of those areas is the ability to do classification, labeling, tone classification a lot more quickly. And I think then that way it'll be cheaper because other than having an individual person put the card sorting, this is okay, this is not okay,
Right.
buckets, AI will be able to do that a lot more quickly. So I think we'll be able to train models more quickly, and that will be helpful for our effort of being able to invest in sort of either proactive moderation, the actual actioning, or the classification of content that then gets reviewed by people. And I anticipate that we will start seeing new types of abuse happening more quickly.
That I can pretty much guarantee. So you also mentioned lessons. So you mentioned you were at the Meta's oversight board. What were the biggest lessons you learned in your time developing that?
It was a really interesting project. It was part of an effort to bring in third-party input and have an accountability mechanism that was intended to give legitimacy and credibility to Meta's broader content moderation ecosystem, particularly as it came to Facebook and Instagram, because those are the two places where there are sort of public sharing of content compared to, say, Oculus or WhatsApp.
Right. Yeah.
And the thing that I found really interesting was that before I got involved, even on the product side of like, how do we build this? How do we structure it in a way that makes the board independent and make sure that individuals can actually appeal to the board and that people's rights in regards to their content and their privacy and their consents are maintained when we have this independent body that's actually on independent hardware, independent and different servers, different bank accounts. How do those systems speak to each other, which was some of the complexity that I had to navigate. There was a 2-year consultative process where Meta did roundtables with leaders around the world to get their input on both who would represent this group of folks who should be on the board. Should it be civil rights activists? Should it be Nobel laureates? Should it be judges? Should it be folks who are experts in a particular type of harm or political navigation? And they ended up doing a really good job. And I think even folks who were pretty critical, we have folks like Kara Swisher and others who comment on Meta on a regular basis, PC Newton, others, were actually kind of positive to neutral about the board, saying, hey, this is actually an interesting effort to create accountability so that Meta's leadership, and often it's like Zuck shouldn't be making the decisions, which of course, obviously he wasn't sitting in a room making all of these calls, but being able to have a additional body of folks who can weigh in on things. And I think that is noble. And
Yep.
I think it also has its limitations. I think similar to third-party fact checking, the number of labels that could be provided by a professional fact-checking label may be 125 a month compared to billions of pieces of content. The oversight board only takes up a certain amount of cases. So in their work, similar to Supreme Court, they actually call them face cases, which I thought was particularly fun as I learned to court practices, because essentially it's representative of something more broadly that then inputs into the policy process, but it doesn't provide a layer on top of all of the millions of decisions that are made.
Okay. Well, that's good. So you mentioned harm, which really leads me into the next question is the impact of policy changes on communities, which is a big piece of your, I think, the part of your passion around why you chose this industry. What, when companies do rollback initiatives like fact checking at Meta, how do you think this impacts the marginalized communities and or the most vulnerable communities in our populations?
Yeah, I saw an interview recently with Brene Brown, and she was talking about the risks of dehumanizing language when we
Mhm.
disagree. And I think that is at the heart of the things that make me most nervous about these changes. The reality is, do I think it's like legal and totally reasonable for Meta to say, hey, we're changing our policies, that we're going to just follow the lines about who are protected groups and not extend that further and sort of draw the line at calling for physical harm? I think it's a reasonable policy change that sort of lines up with some of the political leanings towards the right that the country has sort of requested in this most recent political presidential election.
Yep.
Do you
Yep.
think that there are risks when we allow ourselves, even if the companies are not the ones that are determining what is allowed, to dehumanize others?
Well, and that kind of leads into the civility of everything you've done within your practice. And say designing for civility online is part of your craft. And so you are currently, correct me if I'm wrong, working on a fellowship at Harvard Applied Social Media Labs. And that's aimed at, just to use their, it's aimed at fostering civil discourse. So it's everything you've done in your training, everything you've done as an executive. Could you share more about what's going on at Harvard's Applied Social Media Lab and what you guys are doing there specific to civility?
Yeah, the Applied Social Media Lab within the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard is intended to bring technologists and folks who are used to building product together to think about how do we make social media better. And so my fellowship particularly is looking at how do we decrease polarization, how do we increase civility online. And so I'm busy working on a project with some volunteers to, we're actually working on building a blue sky instance that has some civility features built in, which I'm really excited about. That'll be out sometime later in Q1.
You
Um,
mean like a competitor to Blue Sky?
Not a competitor. We're open. Blue Sky is actually an open source protocol. And so
Got it.
what we're doing is building on top of it and actually adding in some civility features into the app itself so that folks can have some visibility into the toxicity level of what they're saying and actually start learning some bridging techniques, which I think is one of the things that we can all be thinking about using to promote more civility online and to reduce polarization.
Can you give me an example of one of those tools? What does that look like? What is a initiative?
Yeah. So here's an example. When I worked at Nextdoor, we had these sort of kindness nudges, these nudges that would interrupt people as they posted if we saw that what they had typed was uh, toxic or had language in it that we would eventually have to remove based
Mhm.
on our own policies. And so before they even posted it, we would have this little pop up that said, hey, we encourage kindness on this platform. We want you to think about the things
Ah,
you need to
okay.
contribute. Do you want to consider reframing what you have written? And we wouldn't stop people from posting what they wanted to post if they wanted to go ahead and push publish or push post. But it did create a little bit of a moment of reflection and interruption for the poster to think, hey, do I want to add this in to the conversation? We also did nudges if somebody was joining a thread that had already gotten a little spicy, say, on either politics or another heated topic in the neighborhood. And we could tell because it had been flagged or there was a certain amount of language in the exchanges between people on the platform. We would tell people, hey, you're entering a conversation where things are getting a little heated. Be
It's a
mindful,
very spicy dialogue. Yes.
mindful of what you're contributing to the conversation. And so having that moment of reflection, which if you are a mindfulness practitioner, taking a pause, thinking before you act is something that can help all of us, regardless of our age. And so when we're thinking about this new app that we are building, which is going to be called Clear Sky, we're going to have interventions included in that instance that give people a bit of a visibility into the toxicity of their language and also have a bit of a Gen AI rewrite that helps people reframe things in a kinder way.
And how long has this program been around and how long is it going to continue?
The Harvard program or
Yeah, the Harvard program.
it is the lab was given a grant, I believe, for like 2 or 3 years. And so it's a short-term lab where folks are gathering to start, I don't know, knocking their heads together to come up.
Trying to solve big, hairy problems like this. Yeah.
Exactly.
So you mentioned that you've been at Facebook and Nextdoor, and you're now working with startups. What trends are you seeing in how companies approach trust and safety at the beginning of their life cycle? What does that look like, and how does that differentiate?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, as I mentioned, it's a very different ecosystem and stage in the development. I would say most early stage startups are really starting with how do we keep people's data safe? How do we meet basic regulatory requirements like ensuring people under 13, for example,
Mm.
aren't using our platform if the content is
Inappropriate. Yeah.
inappropriate? Exactly. I think age verification is a very, very important one. You'll see that for the gaming industry and for a lot of the uh, multiplayer things we're seeing. There's a lot of content where there is a risk of young folks engaging with people who are either young and ill-intended or adults that have bad intentions or adults that are just trying to have adult only interactions. And I think that is going to be is one area that every company that I've worked with is having to wrestle with. There's new technologies that are working on improving things, but may have come across adult websites where it's just simply a click where you just say like, oh, are you over 18? Or
Yeah.
even to go to look at alcohol ads or certain things, the age gating can be performative.
It seems that way.
Yes. And so I think companies that are really wanting to make an investment in this area are having to really wrestle with how to do it in a responsible way. Young people don't have driver's licenses, like you don't really want to be collecting a lot of personal information. I know you're a parent. I can imagine that you wouldn't want your kids sharing maybe like a Face ID or selfie or other things with these platforms. So what are the mechanisms that we can have in place that prevent young people from being exposed to content that is not appropriate for their age or potentially having them enter spaces where there are individuals who may, have bad intent. I don't want to get into too many of the harmful things that I have to sort of deal with on a professional.
Yeah, I'm sure they're pretty gross.
They're not awesome. So there are people out there who are not, who don't have good intentions. And I think it's important to be mindful about that. Or they just have adult intentions and we need to have sort of that division. And then I think content classification is difficult. And I think smaller companies are now looking at the large companies to see what is happening and how will the government respond, either the US government or other governments that have maybe a different line about what's okay and not okay, to see whether or not they need to be investing in this space at all. So I think it'll be interesting to see in the next sort of 6 to 9 months whether or not startups view this as a signal that they don't need to invest in these spaces, or if there will be a minimum bar of expectation on how they keep people safe.
Okay. And because you mentioned this in your earlier question, or I have mentioned this in your earlier question specific to what a role is for a corporation. And I think that this is where I've seen a lot of debate on this specific to like Section 230, which is that if you're a media company, you're not held responsible at a liability level for content that is posted because there's just too much for everyone to hold on to that. So that said, let's pretend, we fast forward a year from now and Facebook has now turned into Twitter, specific to the vitriol and just I don't, as a personal, I don't take a lot of time on Twitter because I just can't handle it. It's just too negative, and I get my cockles up, and I don't enjoy doing that. Facebook seems to be a little less toxic that way. So if a year from now it is on par with X, and there's just vitriol and anti-Semitism and dehumanizing language, do you think that's the motivation? Specific to a company, their role is number one, to make money, right? That's one thing that I think a lot of young people don't understand is that there is no ethics involved in starting a corporation, right? You can just launch a corporation. And if you're a publicly held corporation like Meta, your job, Mark's job as the CEO, is to placate his shareholders and his board. So he doesn't really give a shit about morals or ethics. I mean, maybe he does, but let's just say he doesn't have to, and he's not held by any standard specific to an LLC or an S Corp or a C Corp or anything that he files. So do you think that if a year from now the vitriol is tenfold, that would be a reason for them to reinstitute some of these policies? Or do you think that they'll just let it rip?
Good question. It's a good call out that Mark's responsibility as a CEO of a publicly traded company is to shareholders.
Yep.
I don't know what I think about that as a sort of a general principle about what that means for our society, but there's been a lot of commentary in the news about the CEOs of the major media and social media platforms sitting at the recent inauguration. And what does that mean for our country? The reality is all of those people's responsibilities are to their shareholders. And if they believe that being in close relationship to the new president is going to help them with their jobs of making more money, avoiding fines, that is their fiduciary responsibility. And so even if I would love everybody to be a B corporation and have a consideration around the social impact that they're having, that's not the reality of some of these places. And so even if we're taking the lens of the importance of increasing shareholder value, we could look at X as an example of the trade-offs of deciding to no longer enforce policies, which I would say is what's happening at Twitter, because there hasn't been a massive change in the policies, but they have let go of a majority of their trust and safety teams, including myself. And you were previously there as, kind of the enforcers of the rules. And we have seen a really large uptick in hate speech, which has been documented in third-party research on X. And we have seen even Elon Musk himself has called out that they have lost more than 50% of their ad revenue. So
correct. And he doesn't care. But see, I think Zuck would, right? I
imagine that Meta would have concerns if they lost about
50% of the revenue. Yeah. Because that would affect shareholders, right? That would affect the board. So
I do think that is something that Meta will need to wrestle with, or any other company if they're thinking about even growing their business. And this is a conversation that I've had with some of the startups that I advise, that even if today there isn't a lot of advertising revenue, say on your platform or gaming platform, for example, but you do want to grow that area, ensuring that the quality of the content is inviting, is positive. People generally want to be there. They feel like they can comment or post or engage or play, whatever the primary act is happening, in a way that is enjoyable. Will have a massive impact on your company's ability to maintain or grow ad revenue over time. And so I think that's something that will be important for Meta to continue to observe. And we will see what happens.
We will. And that's why I asked you, because you've been at both places. And obviously, I come from the ad business, and I have a lot of friends in the media buying side of it that obviously will not be placing ads on Twitter or X anymore, just based on brand safety, right? They're scared to place their creative elements, their creative ads next to something that may be, inappropriate or anti-Semitic or something awful. Let's just say that. And I think that that's where my question goes, specific to the roles. I don't have any, let's just say, any like Pollyanna beliefs that corporations have ethics. I just don't think they do. It's just, maybe I'm old and kind of cynical that way, but they just don't. And I think that whether it's Jamie Dimon or Tim Cook or Mark Zuckerberg or Mark Andreessen or any of the folks that showed up to the inauguration, people always say, oh, they sold out. And you're like, yeah, I understand that point of view. And I also understand the point of view that when the former president of the United States threatened Mark Zuckerberg with jail and coming after his company, that's why he kissed the ring. That's why he donated the inauguration. That's why he showed up with his wife in a suit. And I understand that. I don't necessarily agree with it, but I understand it. And the same things, that's kind of what I was trying to get to with, if the revenue is affected in 2025, that's where I think you might see changes again, because of the same exact reasoning, which is my board is upset that we're losing ad revenue, and my customers, the brands that pay me billions of dollars, are leaving in droves because it's now become an environment that is just toxic and people don't want to be there anymore. And or a whole new population of people have come in, much like Twitter. It's a very different organization. For my listeners who don't really understand the origins of Twitter, it really did have its heyday with journalists. in the beginning. And it was a really cool place to share information, understand stories, understand kind of what was going on in the zeitgeist, not just America, but globally. So it was a really cool platform to actually go and discern and understand what was happening. I think that Twitter is different than Facebook in that sense. Facebook was more of a connective tissue for families and people to share their stories and their food pictures. And obviously, it's become very political over the last many years. But I do believe that if the revenue is affected adversely, I think Mr. Zuckerberg will have to make a shift and put more focus back on the trust and safety. That's just my opinion. It doesn't mean anything because I'm not really versed in the subject, but that's my 2 cents anyway.
Yeah, I think we'll have to see what happens. There are so many different types of activities that people do on Facebook and Instagram. A lot of people use it just to organize their parties or make announcements for their bowling league. And there's so many, or
Yeah.
sell things on Marketplace, that it'll be interesting to see how these sort of shifts in policies impact folks. I'm really hoping that there isn't a massive uptick in dehumanizing language and that
Yeah, me
folks
too.
are focused on, just doing what they used to do back in the day, posting photos of, their kids or their family holidays or connecting with their friends. But I do think that the rubber will meet the road with what are the consequences of removing some of these interventions, which hopefully I really, for all of our sakes, hoping that there isn't a massive change in the overall tone on the platform, but it will remain to see because there's obviously a rolling consequence of how these things are applied over time.
Well, that was very helpful, Fay Johnson. I really appreciate you coming on the show. You taught us a ton, and I look forward to having you back. Let's just say 6 months from now, and let's see how it rolls out.
Yeah, I would love that, Joey. Thank you so much for having me.
You're very welcome.